Okay, hi everyone, welcome. It's lovely to see so many of you here. My name is Jo Applin. I'm Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art in the History of Art Department at the Courtauld. I'm also Director of the Centre for the Art of the Americas, and it is under the auspices of that centre that I am really thrilled to be hosting tonight's event with Irene Small. Irene is Associate Professor of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University, specialising in contemporary art and criticism within a global context. Her areas of interest include experimental practices of the 60s and 70s, legacies of abstraction, temporalities of art, problems of methodology and interpretation, relationality, and the social implications of form. Question we'll be coming back to a lot, I think, this evening. Irene's work engages a variety of geopolitical formations and transnational, translocal contexts, although has paid particular attention to art and theory in Latin America, notably Brazil. Irene's the author of Elio Oiticica, Folding the Frame, that was published in 2016 by the University of Chicago Press. This was the first English language monograph devoted to this Brazilian artist who worked in Rio de Janeiro, here in London, and in New York from the mid-50s through to the late 70s. And its genesis lies in a simple question: how do we imagine the efficacy of works of art if and when they cease being art at all? And it builds from one of the artist's early formal innovations, the elimination of the frame in favour of a fold. And the book argues that Oiticica's works have a powerful function revealed by means of the viewer's embodied engagement and use. She's currently at work on a new book of essays that explores how practitioners have made recourse to truncated and deliberately impoverished forms of media in order to facilitate itineracy, dissemination and connectivity in Brazil from the 19th through to the 21st centuries. She's also, as many of you will already know, an active critic. She sits on the advisory board of October, and her new book, The Organic Line Toward a Topology of Modernism, was published just late last year by Zone Books. There's a copy here on the table. And it takes as its point of departure the Brazilian artist Lygia Clark's notion of the organic line. And it's this that we will be hearing about this evening. So the structure of this event is this. We're going to start with an introduction to the book by Irene, 25 or so minutes, and then she and I will come here and we will have a conversation, and that will be followed by discussion, comments and questions with everybody else, with all of you in the room too. And then at a certain point we will head down this corridor and we'll have a wine reception in our research forum. But for now, I'm going to welcome Irene and hand over.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And first of all, just thank you very much to the research, the team here at the Research Forum at the Courtauld, Diego, who did a lot of the back and forth in terms of the practical details, but really a very profound and heartfelt thanks to Jo Applin, who invited me, but most importantly gave me the gift of being a reader for this book when it was on its way into the world. And books are especially fragile things before they become material objects, especially for their authors. So I'm really indebted to Jo for the immense rigor and joy and intellectual engagement that she brings to this kind of otherwise dry thing we call our historical dialogue. So thank you. So what I wanted to do in terms of this 25 minutes is give a kind of brief introduction to the book as a whole, and then spend a bit of time with some of the wider methodological stakes. And of course, I'm happy to engage any element in the Q&A, but also thank you to all of you for coming in on an otherwise just totally beautiful afternoon. Okay, so let's begin. In 1954, the Brazilian artist Lygia Clark observed that when she abutted a work's framing mat with a collage element of the same color, a line of space appeared between them. She observed that the line was liminal, contingent, and that it was found, not made. In a series of paintings that same year, Clark deployed the line to break the frame of the painting support. The line of space entered the composition while the painting moved out to incorporate the frame. Clark soon connected this undrawn line to the lines of space that appear between doors and lintels, windows and frames, tiles on the floor. She named it the organic line and began to use it as a structuring element in her work. It played a significant role in her painterly and sculptural investigations of the late 1950s and 60s, as well as her subsequent explorations of social and therapeutic practice. For if the organic line initially manifested as a graphic phenomenon internal to the work and its conventions of display, its actualized spatial character just as firmly secured it to an experiential realm beyond the work itself. Unlike virtually any other line in the history of art, the organic line is not a positive entity, by which I mean an entity conceived or perceived as self-evident content or form. A point followed by a line is the minimal condition to establish figure against ground. Whether scratched in stone or drawn in pencil, lines delineate, construct, and register, operations intimately associated with action and the activity of differentiating. As Alexander Rodchenko wrote in 1921, the line is the path of passing through, movement, collision, edge, attachment, joining, sectioning. As a line of space between features, a fissure that is observed rather than made, the organic line is ontologically distinct from this technical and epistemological articulation. In his 1925 pedagogical sketchbook, Paul Klee describes a non-agential line that brings us somewhat closer to its operations. Here, Klee contrasts active lines that move freely without a goal with medial lines that delineate planar effects, and finally passive lines which result from the activation of such planar shapes. In an accompanying illustration, Klee diagrams the conjugations of active, medial, and passive lines, providing linguistic equivalence apropos of a man who cuts down a tree. I fell, I fall, I am felled. But the organic line corresponds to none of these formulations. It is not a degree of agency in relation to a line. It is the space between the tree and the axe. Indeed, it is this nothingness that otherwise escapes legibility that invites metaphoric elaboration. Once recognized as actual, relational, and substantive, the interval of space appears to become a living organic entity, a breadth, a blade, a trace of air, a gutter and furrow, a void that irrigates and cleaves, a crevice and cleft that differentiates matter and ruptures the plane. Although several of these metaphors convey demarcation, the organic line is unusual in the history of art, if not distinct, in that it is a line devoid of a mark. Of course, sight lines and perspectival lines are also lines without marks. But the organic line is not primarily or solely a concept or a projection. As a liminal and lexical phenomenon, the organic line activates and is activated by the material and temporal behavior of its contiguous borders. The line of space that it concretizes is thus a thick void, thick in the sense that it is neither pure emptiness nor a virtual abstraction, but a dimensional, responsive, and actualized entity. The organic line cannot exist without flanking objects or surfaces. It is not a form that delimits its own boundaries so much as a shape that gets filled in. In this sense, one could provisionally define the organic line as space materialized within a relation of material dependence. By conceptually concretizing this space, the organic line recovers the paradoxical materiality of the cavity itself. In my book, I argue that treating the organic line as a conceptual tool allows us to reconfigure the field of modernist art as a flexible and topological surface, porous to that which has exceeded its purview, and capable of formation and deformation through critical description and artistic practice alike. The organic line I offer thus has far-reaching consequences for articulating the relations between modern and contemporary art, the center in so-called periphery, formal innovation, and the politics of making. I chart these possibilities by excavating the moment of appearance of the organic line for Lygia Clark herself, but also by using the organic line to reimagine our understanding of canonical works of modernism and contemporary art alike. So in the first chapter, I try to think about what it meant for Clark to cite Maliewicz's 1915 painting, Black Square, in her own 1954 work, Discovery of the Organic Line. And then what it means for us to approach both of these paintings now, after the 2015 discovery that Black Square contains an inscription on the border of the painting, which reads, Battle of Negroes in a Cave at Night. Here I appeal to the practice of contemporary artists and collectives such as Franci Tres de Fevereiro and Adam Pendleton, as well as theorists such as Hortense Spillers and Zakiya Iman Jackson, who have analyzed the plasticity of the Black body under conditions of white supremacy. Thinking with this critical tradition, I show how the organic line is a space of conversion between incommensurate entities, in order to suggest how the formal and racializing logics of Blackness entail an oscillation between abstraction and representation. In the second chapter, I suggest how the organic line makes us question, first, the gesture of the mark that undergirds artistic practice at its most elemental level, and second, the way in which planes become analogs for subjects and subjectivity. Here I use the organic line to reread John Cage's notorious 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, vis-a-vis what I call the noise of notation that emerges from within the piece's movement breaks. I explore how the queer African-American composer Julius Eastman contested the assumptions of Cage's authorial withdrawal through his realization of the older composer's 0-0, or 433 number 2, as well as through what Eastman called the organic music of a series of compositions polemically titled with the N-word. I highlight the organic line's double action of cleaving apart and together, and the ways in which, at both a psychoanalytic and material level, the splitting and seriality of sibling relations offers ways of activating that which occurs on the side of composition. Then, in the third chapter, I think about how the organic line enters into architectural space to structure spatial, social, and affective networks. I consider how thresholds demarcated by the organic line, which are both speculative and real, facilitate as well as thwart the flow and transfer of energies and affects, putting frictionless standardization and substitutability in tension with contingency and unpredictability. I look at how Clark's early investigations of the organic line anticipate increasingly errant and dissident explorations of architecture, such as her 1968 The House is a Body, Penetration, Ovulation, Germination, Expulsion, which, among other things, is a reworking of Le Corbusier's dictum that a house is a machine for living. Le Corbusier appears in this chapter, too, apropos of his musings aboard a ship to South America, and in dialogue with the work of the contemporary video artist Mika Rottenberg, whose deviant systems of production undermine dreams for ever smoother globalization today. Finally, in the coda, I consider the biological metaphor of the organic line and what it means to treat the work of art and its multivalent boundaries as living entities. Here I appeal to Maliewicz's notion of artistic intervention as a biological infection, as well as theories of autopoiesis, that is, the auto or self-producing capacities of organisms. Autopoiesis was first put forward by the Chilean cognitive biologists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela in the early 1970s, and subsequently taken up by anti-colonial thinkers such as Sylvia Wynter to describe what she called the praxis of being hybridly human. The organic line here allows us to trace how artistic perturbations transform the topology of the systems with which they interact, whether those be aesthetic systems proper to the history of art, or socioeconomic and political systems that condition the emergence of the work of art and its affordances. At this point, I want to take a moment to linger on some of the motivating catalysts for the book, as these points of pressure ultimately became fundamental to my methodology and the larger claims of the book vis-a-vis modernism. And the first observation that I want to make is that the organic line is a weak link, a void, a caesura that conjugates by virtue of its own lack. And this is as true of its spatial character as it is of its historiographic quandary. The organic line can be considered a device, much like the grid, the ready-made, the monochrome, or collage, in the sense that it is a fundamental cultural technique that, while pre-existing modernism, becomes part of the modernist vocabulary when laid bare, as the Russian theorist Viktor Shklovsky famously described it. The concept of the avant-garde proposes that to lay bare the device first is a historical innovation. That such devices are disseminated through the vehicle of influence consolidates notions of authorship and intentionality. And that the circulation occurs across widely divergent contexts suggests that artistic devices approximate a quasi-universal language that can be adapted and reactivated toward distinct yet self-consciously modernist ends. Yet unlike such phenomenon as the ready-made or the monochrome, the organic line has remained obscure within a larger history of art. Artists and critics within Clark's intellectual circuit in Rio de Janeiro, such as Ferreira Goulart, Lygia Clark, and elucidates, were quick to recognize its paradigmatic character. It was pivotal in the subsequent development of neo-concretism and continues to be a point of reference for artists in Brazil. Yet beyond Brazil, we can only trace partial genealogies and pseudomorphic resonances, rather than influence, reception, strong misreadings, and the like. The organic line has no place in the directional flow of MoMA's notorious 1937 chart of abstraction, nor in the network space of its 2012 cartography of invention. One can concede that the chronological frames of such visualizations preclude or perhaps mediate against Clark's inclusion. But even the dialogue between Clark and her counterparts in Buenos Aires, Argentina, who experimented with shaped canvases and irregular frames in the 1940s, is muted at best, as they too were more oriented towards Europe than each other in Latin America. To this degree, the organic line is a symptom of missed connections, fragmented networks, and artistic utterances unheard because they are separated in time and space. These conditions are deeply familiar to any artist or art historian working within the so-called margins, be that a geopolitical, sociocultural, or archival space. Indeed, the very visibility or lack thereof of concepts, works, and artists is part and parcel of the geopolitics of modernity, understood in its most devastatingly expansive sense as an apparatus for the unequal distribution and circulation of capital and power. Yet weak links have their own capacities for elucidation and effect, an agency, we might say, in a minor key. Here I draw from the work of the sociologist Mark Granovetter, who in 1973 described the behavior of strong and weak ties within social networks. Granovetter observed the cohesive power of weak ties in terms of diffusion, and I think his greatest example here is the rumor, that rumors move and expand better through weak networks than through strong networks. But he also noted that weak ties are a means of moving between different scales of analysis. Through them, we can bind micro-level interactions to macro-level patterns. To this end, the organic line is not merely a delimited art historical phenomenon. It is a means to rethink the shape, dimensionality, and texture of modernism itself. Following from this insight, I treat the weak link as a method rather than a requisite means. One of the imperatives of global art history, of course, is to excavate and strengthen cartographies that have not been legible to canonical art history. But I think we also need methods for recovering and narrating links that are fragile and vulnerable, and that often entail, if not failure, opacities or intervals that pertain to institutionality, canonicity, and constraint. Indeed, it is precisely these elisions and fissures, I would suggest, that offer intimations for how to rearticulate the legacy of modernism from a contemporary and even decolonial point of view. In light of these methodological and historiographic challenges, I propose that the organic line allows us to conceptualize modernist art not as a Euclidean space marked by centers and peripheries, vertical traditions and horizontal circumventions, but as a topological field of interactive, destabilizing tensions. Topological spaces emerge from metric spaces, but they dispense with elements such as fixed distances in favor of flexible continuities that bend, curve, and distend. In Clark's Breaking the Frame black and white version 1, for example, one can measure and compare the length of the black tabs that cluster around the edges of the canvas, noting that they index the width of the frame. Yet the tabs also turn the corner of the canvas and frame, extending to the work's verso. The organic line calls attention to how 2 dimensions are converted into 3. But the organic line also exceeds metric space, overflowing the chasm between canvas and frame to connect to the space beyond the work, which is of course also the space in which we encounter it ourselves. In short, the organic line is topological par excellence, even as an emptiness, or more accurately, as a shape of empty space. Topology complicates, if not extinguishes, notions of inside and out, stable orientation, center, and periphery. It allows triangular prisms to torque, closed spheres to transform into elephants or pears, single-sided surfaces such as the Klein bottle to enact spatial recursion. To analogize modernist art to a topological figure is thus to trouble the putative opposition between singular and plural modernities. It is to conceive of modernism not as a historical progression, a zero-sum equation, or an endlessly expanding territory, but a mobile surface whose shape and volume shifts as a result of artistic and historiographic interventions. Any field of artistic production is characterized by lines of explicit, robust, and intentional connection that one can and should trace in time and space. But the very hiatus of the organic line teaches us that such fields are also characterized by links that are speculative, fragile, dormant, or only legible as absence. Moreover, when connections do appear, they are not always rectilinear or direct, but rather, drawing from a botanical term, plagiotropic, meaning slanting, transversal, to the side. Here I draw from the Brazilian poet and theorist Haroldo Campos, who in 1981 wrote of a plagiotropic movement in literature to describe a lateral branching in which writers usurp, convert, and twist their precursors askew. Leaving aside the Harold Bloomian inflection of these actions, we can note that orthotropic growth angles directly towards a stimulus such as light, while plagiotropic manifestations are oblique in relation to such stimuli. In this sense, the plagiotropic invites us to attend not simply to lines of connection, but the spaces and lateral positionality between them. Clark's understanding of the plane as a textile is illuminating in this regard. In 1953, a survey of Mondrian's work at the São Paulo Bienal in Brazil ultimately led her to conceptualize the painterly surface as a woven, topological entity, one in which the very negativity of space was conceived as constructive matter. Describing Mondrian's late works such as Broadway Boogie Woogie on the left, she noted that the Dutch artist treated the plane as a virtual textile made up of overlapping horizontal and vertical filaments. Lines of construction, she wrote, that he atomized via repetition. In her own work, by contrast, Clark observed that she treated the plane materially, revealing the thickness of the line's edge in space, and conversely, the thickness of space as a line. And just to be clear here, in that work on the right, what you're seeing there, those black lines are actually not lines painted on the surface of the canvas. They're lines of space where these plaques, these wooden plaques are being fit together. So there's lines of space that are rupturing that continuity of the plane. Rather than pictorially subdividing a pre-existing surface from its border, as Mondrian did, Clark arrived at a new model of surface as the additive result of surface, edge, and void. Returning to a topological model of modernism, we can newly conceive of a field of modernist art whose mobile shape is formed by such a perforated plane as textile. Across its surface, we can trace strong threads of connection as well as weak links of spatial hiatus, recognizing that both types of relationality are agential and shift the shape of the surface in their own right. Insofar as the grid of any textile requires corresponding spatial fissures, modernism might be conceived as fundamentally constituted by its interstices. In other words, by what at any given time is illegible to the existing representation of modernism itself. This pertains to the second point I want to make about methodology. While I understand Clark is occupying and ultimately deforming a certain exteriority to the major language of canonical modernism, it's important to recognize that for her, and of course for me now, this exteriority was also a fulcrum for thinking about practice. One of the ways that this is so is in terms of the unruly cluster of associations, metaphors, and materialities that surround concepts of woman or the feminine. Clark repeatedly characterized her artistic process through notions of ovulation, pregnancy, and birth. She also articulated her difference from other models of artistic authorship through metaphors that both accentuated female reproductive processes and disrupted their legibility and distribution across bodies, species, behaviors, and effects. In a 1969 letter, she wrote of finding my portrait in a documentary about a scorpion whose extreme solitude is conveyed by the horrifying and beautiful process of its molting, which Clark likened to a slow birth from the carapace of its prior skin. Clark also commented on the scorpion's lethargy after she lays her eggs, impervious to the movements of her offspring across her body once they hatch. In this recounting, birth stretches across self-production and progeneration, each solitary and self-differentiating in its own way. Clark observed that while most artists vomit themselves out in a process of great extroversion, her own process was to swallow evermore in a process of introversion in order to ovulate in a lamentably dramatic manner, one egg at a time. She noted that this ovulatory process had nothing to do with invention, but rather generation. I only know that being fertilized and ovulating is my manner of holding on to the world. In this process, she added, I am alone. Western culture has long analogized artistic insight to a seminal spark of creative genius, wherein the male artist appropriates the female reproductive capacity of gestation and birth, while retaining the causal agency of conception. And here we have only to recall the etymological link between seminal and semen. This is precisely the trope of invention that Clark dismisses, characterizing it as both a vomiting and an extroversion. By contrast, she offers up ovulation and generation as the relevant processes for her art, metaphors that compel us to imagine temporal alternatives to the patrilineal drive for origins that has long structured the history of art. By disengaging generation from invention, for example, Clark's articulation invites us to comprehend both artistic and historiographic processes as catalyzing, propulsive, and multiplicative, in short, engendering, rather than defined narrowly by the production or the proprietary capture of artistic or intellectual territory. For Clark, this process was akin to that of cellular mitosis. From 1 to 2 to 3 and then more, one thing always comes from another, and it is an extremely intimate communication, from pore to pore, hair to hair, sweat to sweat. By foregrounding the organic line as a phenomenon that is located within, but also exceeds Clark's work, my book invites us to linger within the particularity of the organic line, as well as to move laterally and plagiotropically, opening out onto other artists, chronologies, operations, and effects. By limning the organic line's paradigm of interstitiality as a historical phenomenon, method, and tool, the book seeks to actively reconstellate the manifold roots of the contemporary. In so doing, it comprehends modernism as neither a static construct nor a fixed limit, but a series of dynamic and reciprocal edges. From the standpoint of topology, after all, edges are merely surfaces that change shape with greater or lesser acuity. The organic line situates us alongside this topological feature and directs our attention to how the surface shifts as a result. Insofar as tracing such perturbations of existing systems can also specify the worlds they call into being, I also understand this charting as a constructive operation as well as a political act. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. That was a really terrific introduction to the book, which I've had the pleasure of reading twice now, in page proofs, and then secondly in its beautiful object-like form here. I think, for me, what you presented here so eloquently was this really expansive argument about the organic line as conceived by Clark as this hinge or an opening, a kind of interstice, and a weak link, which I think opens the possibility for rethinking this field of modernism that we think we know, but also, and this became clear in your talk, and I think throughout all of your writing, about it speaks to the vexed relationship between abstraction and the social, which I think lies at the heart of so many of these debates, and I think it would be nice to hear more about that, and I think we will as we talk this evening. But I wanted to say too, what a pleasure for me it was reading this book, because it really does combine deep archival research. This is where you spend your time, but at the same time you work with Lygia Clark's own words, as well as that of her other interlocutors. And it really conjures a complex and theoretically rich rethinking of the field of modern art that expands beyond Lygia Clark's own work to speak to the condition of abstraction. And I think one thing we might talk about as well is the structure of the book, the monographic form, more broadly, like where you're thinking around that, because it's such itself a vexed form in some ways that we all think about when we write them. And I wondered if we could maybe think about some of these, and perhaps that might... Let me start with a question for you about modernism, because the book centres on Clark's organic line and the remaking of this modernist trajectory via this series of weak links and constellations. But you choose to retain modernism. You don't just let it go and just move elsewhere. And it's like an anchor. You don't do away with it. You want to rethink it, or Clark wants to rethink it. So, yeah, maybe you could say a bit more about modernism.
Thank you. Well, so one thing that I would say is that when one is working in a place like Brazil, or a place that has not been a kind of center of a phenomenon such as modernism historiographically, but also perhaps in terms of practice, working through the specificity of the archive to me is the most important and somewhat the political thing to do, because it's from that specificity that theoretical concepts emerge, and otherwise I think we risk sort of placing theoretical concepts ready-made on material, and we don't actually find the kinds of specificity that the artists were dealing with at the time. So I think, in my first book on Elucidates Sika, he very much embraced the notion of modernist invention. So he was an inventor alongside all of these other great inventors of modernism. And Lygia Clark, too, embraced modernism. And so part of my thinking with this was to take seriously that deep love for modernism, which I actually myself share, too. But at the same time, people who have been located in these places have a somewhat vexed relationship to it for various reasons. One is that they often don't get to see these works in person. In Brazil, you have the phenomenon of the Sao Paulo Biennale, and so many artists were actually able to have this real encounter, for example, with Mondrian, and to see, for example, that the whites of the Mondrians are different, that these are not just design, they're paintings, and they have a materiality and an expressivity on their surfaces. But at the same time, there's these kind of spaced relationships and impossible connections that can't be made. And I think in my first book, I worked against those. I always wanted to find the smoking gun. And Oiticica wrote like he wrote all the time. So I had a huge archive to work with to form direct connections. But the more I worked on this material, I encountered these situations. Well, why weren't they in touch with this person in Buenos Aires, for example? Or how come I can't get access to the education department's archives at the Museum of Modern Art? Well, they don't have enough staff to let me in there. So you're always running up against these institutional or larger dynamics of power, like, for example, between Argentina and Brazil, that they were so oriented towards France that they failed to kind of see each other at this critical moment that they were both thinking about the plane and the irregular frame. So one of the things that became clear to me in thinking that problem as itself a modernist problem was the idea that instead of thinking about modernism as a positivity, we can also think of it as riddled with these interstices or these weak links, these failures. And as soon as I started to think that way, it made a lot more sense to me. So, for example, a traditional way of thinking about influence would be, Max Bill comes from Switzerland to Brazil, influences Lygia Clark. She takes up the notion of the Mobius strip in all of these topological forms like Cambiano and so forth. And that's definitely true. But what I found in looking carefully at the trajectory is that, well, she missed that show that he had. And she was maybe thinking about ARP. And there's little bits of possibilities. ARP seems to have owned one or more of her works. But there was never like the smoking gun connection. And so I tried to start to think with those, what I call plagiotropic or weak links. But at the same time, I think what's really important about modernism is that it has this, and particularly the organic line is what I call a device, like the grid or the monochrome, is that they have this kind of heuristic value, that through them you can understand how artists are making differentiations. So, when I first started on this book thinking about the organic line as a kind of, exactly, as a heuristic, as a conceptual tool to think through another set of theoretical problems, I started to see, well, the organic line is at play in all of these other practices, like Cage's 433, but we don't call it an organic line because nobody knows about it. Well, why is that so, right? If we know about, we can trace the Duchampian influence and so forth, the fact that there's these utterances that are kind of like lost in space, let's say, through the geopolitics of the modern, that element was important for me to unpack. And for me, thinking with George Kubler's work of understanding works of art as kind of situated in possible sequences, but that may not be received until many years, possibly hundreds of years later, got me out of a kind of positivist notion of sheer influence. Mm-hmm. And because in modernism we have the benefit of artist letters and contacts, we often try to trace the network exactly as is. But when you're working in places where you can't trace those networks or they've been ruptured violently, I think we'd have to start to use different methods.
Mm-hmm. So things like the missed encounter, the failure, yes. The what might have been become quite motivating.
Yeah,
that's so interesting. So so you mentioned Duchamp there. I kept thinking about the inframance, the ultra thin,
yeah.
And that's really not operative in this book. You are doing something different here, and I thought that was, there's something you're doing modernism otherwise, and so this idea of in itself a kind of interstitial. I don't know. Yeah. It's more of a space, I suppose, rather than a line that sort of. Yeah. Remain, like kind of what remains, I suppose, in some way. But the organic line, which is of course Clark's own word that you're kind of using here as a new heuristic, like like the grid permits us to think these different connections otherwise, and that also allows you to bring in a lot of contemporary practice, which I thought was, that has these very different geographic locations and so being rooted differently socially. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about the cast of characters, as it were, that we meet in the book.
Yeah. Yes. So I was mentioning when we were having tea, I started this project before the 2015 conservation analysis on Malievich's Black Square, which revealed this kind of inscription. And I, was already committed to, there's only 6 organic line paintings that Lygia Clark did the year that she basically discovered this, right? So all 6 are important if you're going to make a project on the organic line. And only one of them is called The Discovery of the Organic Line. And I didn't understand why. And it has a citation of Black Square. And of course, she wouldn't have known about this inscription, but I know about it. So then it really, actually Bryony Fair's work on the kind of instability of Black Square as a moment of origin, it's always placed in an origin, but always by means of this series of supplements. I realized that I had to kind of take that way into the contemporary. And as I thought about that project, it was very clear that it's contemporary artists, such as Adam Pendleton or Ferenci Teresa de Fevereiro, which is a Brazilian collective, kind of activist collective, that are showing us the ways to rethink the modernist canon. So, someone like Adam Pendleton is constantly constellating and concatenating these series of references, and the kind of the noise of the transmission becomes important to his practice. And that in turn helped me sort of think about thematizing that. So instead of like, sectioning off, like, okay, well, these are contemporary practitioners, I thought, well, it's actually by virtue of that contemporary practice that I can see what was there all the time, but had not been kind of visible in the same way. So, there's another, maybe I just want to flip to one image here. This is a work by Cameron Rowland that also became very important to me, a contemporary piece. And this looks ostensibly like sculpture, but what this is, these are objects that are made by incarcerated people who are being paid, cents per the hour. So there's a way in which this incarcerated labor is internalized within a kind of system that has long roots in the United States going back to slavery, right? And Artist Space, where he shows this, is able to show these works because they become a client of these prison systems, right? And so all of a sudden, what we think we're looking at as static sculptures all of a sudden become live systems in which the carceral state is employing people, paying them, basically, this is kind of coerced labor, resulting in these objects that then gain visibility to us by virtue of artist space pairing. And so what I started to see was that these sculptures have this kind of ligation to these multiple systems, a sculptural system by which we can understand it aesthetically, but also economic, political, and historical systems that all create this kind of organism. And for me, the organic line is the means by which we can understand the interface between a static material object and these systems that are kind of co-producing it over time. And so part of what I wanted from the organic line as what I call, this is a kind of paramonograph rather than a monograph per se, is that we can use the organic line as a tool to rethink contemporary practices.
Because of the fissures and the gaps, rather than this being chronological or linear, or this leads to this, that actually in those interstices between, there's a space where something else is happening. So this in a way is what we talked about earlier as well, that I think is common throughout your writing, is this deep commitment to abstraction and a deep political commitment to the way the work makes its way in the world or is at large in the world. And I think with these works we can kind of see that quite clearly articulated, but in Lygia Clark's own practice we see this happen too, don't we, with the critters, with the folding forms and so on. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about her own work, how it moves from where the organic line features in that shift in her own practice, which everyone might not be familiar with in fact.
I mean, I think, I don't think that I would be wrong to say that the organic line was the most important discovery of Lygia Clark's career. I mean, she sort of treated it as such. And I think what we see over the course of her career, which is not treated in the book, right? Like it doesn't attempt to kind of do a monograph of all of her practice, is that she uses it as this like kind of recourse for rediscovery. So it takes on all these different forms. So to give like one example that I always love and that I do with my students, she has this wonderful work called Stone and Air. And you blow up a plastic bag with your own breath, put a rubber band around it, and put like a little pebble on the edge. And because it's filled with breath, you can manipulate its outside, and that moves the stone. So suddenly air is agential in relationship to this solid thing, which is, this stone. But there's all these interesting ways in that we can think of it if we think of the organic line as the interstice between two other elements. All of a sudden now you have the volume of air that has been enclosed and given a kind of definition by the bag, which is also sort of continuous at the level of materiality, right? I mean, it's air also with the envelope of space around us. But it's also differentiated by virtue of this kind of tissue of the plastic bag and the fact that the air comes from inside of us, right? So all of a sudden the organic line within us, like our breath, produces this kind of volume. So you can see the way that she rethinks the organic line as this kind of this way to also break down binaries into more complex sets of relations. And towards the very end of her life, she, as I briefly mentioned, started this kind of therapeutic practice and was sort of uninterested in being called an artist. But one of the beautiful things I think about this practice is that it has a kind of, not psychoanalytic, but there's a psychic element of it, like related to the psyche. But it's also deeply corporeal. And one of the ways that she describes the kind of trauma that people have is that there's voids that are opened up in their, it's not exactly the body, but it's a kind of blend of the body and the psyche. And so it's not to close up those voids, to like heal them, like patch them up. It's to move them around so that they can function in a different way. So she had, I think, this very beautiful idea of living within the void, right? It's not to say that the cure is to cover up the holes or the fissures or so forth, but to live within them and restructure them so that they can articulate differently. So when, the images that you may have seen, perhaps, of Lygia Clark, where there's, where she's with a client and there's all these kind of bags and shells and so forth, these are understood to be kind of focalizations that can move the kind of topology of this kind of body psyche apparatus.
I mean, that's so interesting because we just had some of Lygia Clark's works, the Whitechapel, so you could play with this particular work with the stone and the air. And I think what I found so generative in your recounting of the organic line is that because it could run the risk of being constantly described in terms of what it isn't as a kind of negative thing until you can't quite hold on to it anymore. But that isn't the case, and I think this sense of it being, it's not a neutral, it's not a negation, it has agency, it's an operation that has real force, aesthetically as a form of abstraction, but also in the social or in the participation of more than one body. And I think that's what I think is one kind of line that connects through the book, the para monograph. So can I ask you a bit about this?
Well, I just wanted to say, because I think that actually goes to your Duchamp, the discussion of the enfant because so the way that initially I also thought, okay, is this like the infra-thin for Duchamp? Because he describes it, for example, the difference between two cast from the same mold, right? Something like that. But I ended up deciding for myself that the organic line was extra thick rather than infra-thin because it's a difference that makes a difference rather than dissolves difference, right? Like you can conceptually hold on to the difference that Duchamp is pointing to, but with the organic line, it's a difference that actually makes a material difference, like those gaps of space. And architects know this very well, because anywhere you see an organic line is a space of potential misalignment for architects, because once you can draw a straight line, but you can't build one and not have it have a thickness. Like every line has a thickness. So I think this question of like when that minute difference actually makes the difference is really interesting at a spatial and material level. But then moving into the social, one of the things, the way I kind of end the book is to say to the reader, like, not make it, I feel like, what we understand is like make a mark, make an intervention. This is kind of the way we're taught to make meaning. And I'm trying to suggest that the organic line gives us this other model, which is find a distinction and dilate the liminality that it holds, and then try and understand what's happening on either side. And that's kind of why I have these other images. I mean, obviously, I'm coming from the United States in this extremely fraught situation where we have, the multiplication of the border transnationally across these multiple spaces, and we also have the dilation of carcerality where prisons are being turned into detention camps and so forth. So, and these are also for profit. So this goes back to, the Cameron Rowlands. Like, how can we think of these systems as actually operating to secure a kind of identity, but also dilate? So in that sense, I think, the organic line gives us a kind of, or I hope that it gives us this kind of descriptive vocabulary that we can use to apply to a whole set of other things, not just Lygia Clark. With my first book, which was called Folding the Frame, sometimes people would ask me, well, do you think folding the frame can apply to other artists' work? And I was a little bit hesitant of feeling like, I didn't feel like it was an entirely portable concept. Whereas with the organic line, I do feel that it is actually a device like the grid or the ready-made, in that it has this portability that can be used at the level of practice, but also analysis.
I mean, and that's what makes this such a interesting approach to the ostensibly monographic form, right, of a book about Lygia Clark, which in many ways it sort of is and it isn't, because it's got this bigger ambition, which is to say something, to let the organic line say or do something else beyond her practice, which, I mean, I think in many ways that work around the fold does, but I take your point with Oitosika that perhaps that was very particular to his practice. But in that book, you start to see this idea, I think, having now read this book, that what are the biggest stakes for thinking about these gestures, these marks, these lines. And so could you just talk a bit about how you decided to organise this book? And could you say something about feminism, and which kind of comes in and out throughout the book too?
Okay, well, so the way, the origins of the book lie, I was asked to write this essay about medium specificity and what do we think about medium specificity today? And because of the first book on Oitosika, where I was really looking at works of art that had behavioral elements, they either worked with a participant's behavior or they were behaving themselves in some form. So it would be wrong to look at them as pure sculptures because they actually were initiating a kind of circuit of behavior through their structure, right? So through that, I was already thinking of works of art as enacting a kind of temporal, having a kind of temporal circuit which produces their identity. And through thinking about the German theorist Niklas Luhmann, initially, I started to understand that it was actually form that was producing itself recursively, and not medium. That medium could be aspecific, and so that a single work like Cameron Rowlands, it's the form is there, right? But the mediums, you could say, is carcerality, is institutionality, is a whole set of other it makes meaning in relationship to all of those different mediums. So in order to try and explain this, like how does this work, I kind of came to the organic line and I was like, this is so useful. This is like this amazing device I can think with. It's like I was like, I have a hammer, and I can use it to think. So then I was like, oh, I should write some more essays about how to think with this thing. So the structure of the book initially was like, what are the defining characteristics of the organic line? So the first one is sort of convertibility. The second is kind of that it's on the side of composition, and the third relates to its kind of architectural interstitiality. So I really tried to say, like, what are the qualities of the organic line, and then move from there. And then sort of as I had written, like maybe a little bit more than maybe 1.5 chapters when COVID hit, and at that time those chapters were written a little bit more archivally. None of them went like straight into the contemporary. I had to pause for like 1.5 years, almost 2 years. And then when I went back to it, I just felt more free to actually enact it, or try to enact it in the book in terms of moving to the contemporary and backwards. I guess there's another thing that I actually do talk about quite a few artists from North America, from the United States. And I think that's sort of interesting because I'm resisting, on the one hand, I'm saying, well, part of the reason that we don't know about this device is because of Lygia Clark's very specific location, mostly in Brazil. Of course, she worked in Paris too. But at the same time, I really want to resist a kind of nationalist production of her only making context in relationship to Brazilian artists. And of course, I'm seated in the United States, and I think one of the things that I take from feminism at this most fundamental level is, what is your positionality? Like, from where do you speak? So I think that's, like, from being a feminist, like, almost as long as I can remember as an adult, I take that as kind of a point of departure. I think the other thing about feminism is that Lygia Clark was like kind of notorious for rejecting it, rejecting feminist artists, rejecting the language around it. And yet, the way that she thinks about the woman as a category is so dissident and disruptive. And I was like, how can we think with that? And I think that more recent theory, especially stuff coming from queer theory, has allowed us to, I would say, sort of queer feminism to allow these kind of other dissident elements to come through. And what I ended up really seeing, especially through thinkers like Sylvia Wynter, who think about autopoiesis and the construction of the human, is that Clark was not, like, it's never about this kind of affirmation of humanity. She's like, what is a human? Am I human? I don't know. Like, what is it when I give birth? There's like a sea creature inside me, and then all of a sudden, she herself is constantly experimenting with the boundaries of a human, not from a pre-existing place, but from an unknown place in the work. And I think that there's something deeply feminist about that too. But that resists a kind of identitarian notion of, like, I as a woman am aligning with other women because of our shared identity. She would never sign on to that.
Thank you. I have lots of other things that I would like to ask you, but this might be a good moment to see if we've got any comments or questions or thoughts from the audience. We do have a roaming mic, if you could just hold on for that. There we go, there's someone there. Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. It was really good. I say that as an artist, and I think the next time I approach a modernist art, with your interpretation and description of the organic line, I think I'll see a lot more movement. But what I was going to ask is, you put a lot of importance on space. So I wonder if you could sort of give us a few descriptions and characteristics of the space. I mean, is it empty? Is it full? Does it have certain characteristic? I think, if you were to look at space through a sort of an Indian Ayurvedic perspective, it would be full of that. Or if you were to look at it from sort of a Japanese traditional artistic perspective, it would be full. And then could you also say a little bit about the relationship between the space and the line?
Just gonna
Is it sort of a is there a dependency there? Is space actually required for the line to exist? So yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the space and maybe a little bit about the specificities of the relationship between the two. Thanks.
Yeah, those are complex questions. One way that has been helpful for me to think about it is, for example, in contrast to something like pages 433, where you have what seems like emptiness that becomes full. So he understands the 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence as, in fact, there is no silence and all of that is full. What I see Clark doing is different than that inversion model. And so sometimes I've sort of described it as a double negative. It's a negative that remains negative rather than one that is simply transformed into full. Sometimes it is. But so, for example, in this work, so this is the organic line. It goes all the way around the top, right? Of course. And then this is a line that's made out of paint. Now, in this area, because of the way she's painted this portion of the frame, you can clearly see the way that this acts compositionally, right? So it becomes, you could say, the emptiness becomes full and becomes something like a graphic mark. However, it continues all the way around and we don't notice it at the top. So there's a kind of fugitivity to the organic line in which sometimes it appears to have this fullness and sometimes it disappears. And I think it's the fact that it does this, that it's constantly converting. Because after all, if we call it a line, it's because we are projecting a representation of a line upon it. So even that very act transforms it from literal space into a representation of a line, even though at the level of matter, it's the same thing, right? So I think that's one way that is helpful for me to think about it, the way that it changes even over the course of a single work. Another thing that helped me think about it was, Malevich has this like fascinating, statement where he says, life wishes not to live, but to rest. Like, what does that mean? Life doesn't want to live. And I actually started to understand the organic line as having that relationship. So if you fill a glass of water, right, the water is sort of passive, but it lives in relationship to the boundary of the glass. So it has a kind of identity or entity that it holds, but it doesn't want to do anything except stay exactly as it is. So it's kind of counterintuitive because it has a passivity at the same time as once we recognize what it's doing, it actually can be very agential. So I think it's always working as well with our own observation, and that's the kind of key, I would say, whereas Lygia Clark has been very much connected to the history of neo-concretism, and the participant becomes the most important element. Here, I think it's really the observer. Like the observer, the organic line always has to be actually happening in space, but also have an observer to pull it into cognition. Question.
Concerning the line, we think of a line that we draw, but actually it's the meeting of two planes. I'm a practitioner too, so
I love
that's
that.
it's how I see a line.
Yeah.
It's a meeting of planes. I think you're really hitting on something absolutely crucial to 20th and 21st century art and the birth of modernism, which before that, the work was centralized in a frame or as a sculpture, an entity in itself. What Lygia Clark and people before her did was they said, no, there's a space outside. So if you look at these here, this vertical line, lots of vertical lines in contemporary, is taking you, if you follow that line, it's taking you outside the picture plane.
Yes.
It's taking you into life.
Yeah.
So it's deeply philosophical and it's deeply political and it's deeply social, because this is the intervention which the artist is inviting people to take part in, as in the Whitechapel where we could play with the, I forget the names now.
Bichos.
Yes, and it's. I think you've hit on something absolutely
She hit
crucial.
Yeah.
Well, you're underlining it.
Yeah.
It's absolutely crucial how the relationship has changed between something which you look as an entity and admire to something which you are being invited into. You're being pulled in by that little bit of vertical line there, going from the green through the two shades of grey, that is pulling us out, pulling us in.
Yes.
And a lot of contemporary art deals with the fragment, if you're a sculptor, which is basically the same idea because it's suggesting what is not there.
Right. Yeah.
So that's more of a comment.
Yeah. No, but you know, I was at a discussion some time ago at MoMA, and we were looking at a Gordon Matta Clark sculpture, let's call it that for now, one of his cuttings, and somebody said, look at the beauty of the cut, right? Like that this is the kind of, you know, this is in the tradition of sculpture, the cut is so beautiful even though it's part of an architectural structure. And then Thomas Lax, a curator at MoMA who's totally brilliant, said, well, one of the things that's interesting is to think about the relationship to the Bronx where he cut these, right? What was happening in the Bronx and the dereliction of these architectural spaces where he made this cut. And so what I think that comment that Thomas Lax did was to dilate exactly the organic line between the cut of the sculpture, which said this is a sculpture, it's independent, we can look at it with a certain kind of autonomy, and the idea that in fact this is a work of art that makes vis-a-vis this organic line, which is of course invisible at this point, has this relationship to an urban, sociopolitical, economic, historical context that we entirely lose if we only attend to the interior of that line. So it's kind of like any work of art has an interiority. You can sort of trace it that way. But if we think about the exteriority of the edge, what happens on this side? And I think that's a question that can be asked of almost any work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation, and I cannot believe I haven't read your book already. But so my question is also about your presentation, and it's beautiful what you're doing, you know, your approach to archival material, tracing these interrupted links with knowledge of the fact that many of these institutions archived and custody things with a view to France, in this case for Argentina and Brazil, for example. You put a picture of Oscar Boni's La Familia Obrera, and I was wondering what that interrupted connection was.
Oh, I was suggesting, well, this is like, you know, this is a way we can think of the ready-made, right? It's like, now here's, you know, he puts a living family on a pedestal, mobilizing this notion that you put an object of life, in this case a social unit, for analysis as a work of art. Right, so that is not necessarily an interrupted link. That would be more what I would say is like, you can read a direct link. And that would be a way to read that art historically. So that one is not, that's not a big link, yeah.
Or any other.
I have a good one for you. Yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking about at a kind of formal level was, of course, Frank Stella and deductive structure, because of the notion of the frame. And of course, they never knew each other. Let's see, sorry, I have a detail. Maybe I don't have a detail. Oh wait, here it is. Okay. So, so Michael Fried very famously wrote about deductive structure vis-a-vis the framing edge. But for me, who I'm looking at the organic line, I'm like, look, there's an organic line right there. And so it's not as simple as saying deductive structure, because what do you mean? Because this line of space also speaks to this unmade line here. And Frank Stella talks about these as breathing spaces. But it means that there's an equivocation around the whole notion of deductive structure. And if we take seriously this line of space as part and parcel of the work, then and we think topologically, we turn the corner of this, and of course Stella painted the sides of his frames, and they were the same thickness as the brush too. So we start to have a different kind of relationship. Now, Stella and Clark didn't know each other, but interestingly enough, they were both collected in 1972 by the great Brazilian critic Mario Pedrosa in Chile. Now, Pedrosa went into exile during the military dictatorship in Brazil and went and tried to start this Museum of Solidarity with Salvador Allende. And he, through his contacts, got donations from both Stella, this painting, this protractor series, and Lygia Clark's Bichat the same year in 1972. But in 1973, of course, the CIA sponsors and helps the Pinochet coup, and Allende is killed. And the whole idea of this museum has to go into exile. So this photograph, which I took at the current headquarters of the Museo de Solidaridad Salvador Allende in Santiago de Chile, the building was only able to be realized after the Pinochet coup, decades and decades later, right? So the idea that, in fact, these could have a comparison, but the link was ruptured, so it was lost to art history at the moment. Like, this is like, this is power intervenes, right? This is a weak link where I think it's important not to say, oh, we can compare, Frank Stella and Lygia Clark, but we have to say, look, what happened? A coup,
Amazing.
Thanks for the talk and writing the book, which I really enjoyed. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you see as the political horizon of Lygia Clark's work. Because I think you do a really good job of showing how the organic line allows us to reinterpret or talk received ideas about what modernism was or is. But do you think it's also possible to think of Clark's discovery and similar uses of negative space in the work of artists like Ortega as responses to political developments inside Brazil? So do you think the military coup of '64 is important for how we think about Clark's work or trajectory? And if so, how, or if not, why not? Because the organic line as a discovery is kind of squeezed between two dictatorships in the history of Brazil, which is also kind of liminal space. Or
Yeah. I mean, she discovers the organic line in 1954, and the dictatorship happens in 1964. So I don't know if squeezed, that's like a whole decade, right? So part of what I tried to do was really concentrate at an archival level. I mean, of course, I'm moving in lots of different directions across chronologies. But at the archival level, I was trying to understand what happens between 1954, when she discovers this, and 1956, when she makes a public exclamation. So not try to say that Brazil is all of these different things, because I think that really flattens out the kind of specificity of what's happening. Certainly that there is a kind of contextual relationship to what's happening in Brazil, and that mostly comes up, I think, in the third chapter, where I address the kind of period rhetoric of modularity. So this was kind of a way of thinking substitution, modularity, standardization in Latin America within a very positive discourse about modernization. So on the one hand, her discourse around, for example, using the organic line within modules architecturally participates in this. But if we see where she goes, and we actually look at what the organic line does, which is dilate a space of contingency, it's actually very errant in relationship to those, the desires for that standardization to kind of organize the world all over, right? So that it can be organized and segmented and so forth. It's definitely not a kind of social history of art that I'm doing around 1954 per se, and one could do that. There are elements that have been brought out in different treatments of Lygia Clark, but there is a kind of internal politics that I think is clear. Let me give you another example. In 1954, so when the same year that she kind of discovers the organic line, there's like an artist strike in Brazil against color, because the government had said, we're going to tax imported paint, because they were trying to jumpstart the Brazilian economy, and this like pertains to like very long histories of coloniality. And the artists say we can't make our work without imported paint because Brazil doesn't have enough of an industry. So they made works all in black and white. And Clark just shows 2 frames. So the very notion that she's thinking in this very she's thinking about the sheer structure and the architecture of what a painting is and what happens when you don't have access to these things. This is informed by specificity that is right there at 1954, right? At the same time, for it to be a paradigm, I think it has to be loosened as well. So, one of the ways I think Giorgio Agamben has helped me think about a paradigm is the notion that the paradigm happens in between singularities. So 1954 is a kind of singularity that you could sort of expose in lots of different contextual directions. But for it to be a paradigm that we can then use to think about Cameron Rowland, it has to kind of lift up and then touch down again with a different set of specificities. But the paradigmatic character of it, its capacity to be used as a tool, it needs to lift up to do that. So that you could also say that's a problem with theory, right? But I do think that theory is useful as well. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, there's a question right there.
Thank you for your talk. My question is about the word organic in the term organic line, because I'm not sure if I'm understanding it correctly, but when you made the reference to how organic lines are challenges for architects, is it organic because you can't quite control it? It's not like making a mark, it's something that happens without your control? And if so, I was wondering if Lygia Clark speaks to that herself, or if that's part of your understanding.
Yeah. So that was also a big kind of question. Why did she call it organic? If you look at her trajectory, it's very clear that she moves into this kind of organic, corporeal, those are her kind of investments increasingly as she moves on. But in 1954, it's not so clear exactly why she would call it organic. And what I understood is that there's kind of a couple different competing discourses around the organic. One is which is kind of used within architectural discourse to say like the way things fit together. So you would say like your knuckles fit together and like elements of a house or an urban structure should fit together organically. But there's another discourse that say unless it has animation, it's not organic. So what is the vivacity of an entity? It can't just be a set of mechanical parts. So she's sort of working between the two of those in 1954, I think. But the most important thing is to recognize that she is resisting the notion of the organic as biomorphic. So there's lots, like Arp's works are biomorphic. Roberto Burle Marx, the landscape architect in Brazil that she studied with, there's lots of biomorphic forms that we would tend to think, oh, the serpentine line, these are organic because they're not straight. But for her, the straight line is often the most organic one because it's swelling and it's contingent and it's you can't predict it. So one of the things that I also learned by looking very carefully at these 6 works in the series is that because canvas and wood expand at different rates and according to different humidities, the organic line is never the same all the way around one of these works. And in some cases, it's very, very thin and it's squeezed. In other cases, it kind of gets bigger. So that's what is the organic part of the organic line.
There's a question up the back there.
It's much less poetic question, so it's quite practical. But I was really struck by when you showed those network analysis diagrams, even the kind of the later one, the 2012 one that seemed incredibly complex one there, just draws to attention the way that increased complexity can kind of seduce us into feeling we have coverage. And all of these areas are drawn. And I was really interested in your exploration of the weak links or missing links, paleotropic links. And I wondered whether you would consider a way of articulating those visually, or whether they are incompatible with the type of diagramming that has been sort of used in various sort of visions, histories, and modernism over time. And also whether sort of the nature of the organic line is inconsistent with the network line on flat surface because it breaks down the binary, so it just doesn't form those.
Right.
So yeah, so it's a question to you, would you consider using a networking diagram to elucidate what all those links that you discussed?
I mean, I think the topological little diagrams, I mean, I tried to find a 1954, or I did find a 1954 mathematics textbook to, just, for a sense of, okay, this is what things might have looked like back then to think about topology. I think that's helpful because it shows many different iterations. And so what I understand modernism, my version of modernism is like, it's not like we're scooping in more things that have been mistaken and then we put them all and we know where they are and we've got it right, but rather that like what we understand modernism is constantly changing, so it's like this mobile, always transforming surface. So you could diagram what it might look like at a moment, but it would change, right? So those are more kind of just to show the possible change. I think the most useful model would be really material, like a piece of woven textile that really shows that, if you think about a pattern that is woven into a textile, you could make like the cartoon of that to transport it elsewhere, and that would be like a representation. But in the thing itself, you always have to have space. So you can never have any composition within a woven textile without also having space, and that's the model that I think makes most sense. So it's a material model rather than a visual diagram, I would say.
Thank you. Okay, we're at 7, so I just had a couple of things to finish. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we have some flyers here. If anyone would like to buy the book, the publisher is giving a 30% discount, so please help yourself to one of these. And it's also written on there, you can just take a photograph. And also, just before we all thank you, I wanted to thank you so much, Irene, for that, not just for this extraordinary book, from which I learned so much, but this evening, which has been much more than a book presentation. I feel like we've been all your students this evening, and I think the experience of what it must be like to be in a classroom with you was an unexpected treat. So thank you so much for being so generous with us all. Thank you all for your brilliant contributions and questions. What an excellent way to start the week. So thank you very much. Thank you.